Good evening. Mr. Haas, members of the council, guests, and friends, it's a pleasure to welcome you to another session of the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs. We're especially looking forward to our address this evening, which of course is extraordinarily topical. Before our introduction is made by Mr. Bradford Jacobs, the Vice Chairman of the Board of Trustees, who's known to most of you, I'd like to make just a couple of quick announcements. First of all, I'd like to thank the Westinghouse Corporation for the reception this evening. And secondly, the World Trade Center Institute for co-sponsoring the program. On January the 11th, we'll have our next program. It's always one of our highlights. It's the 4th Annual Sun Papers Foreign Policy Panel. And we're always pleased to welcome Mr. Stern, Mr. Cordry, and Mr. Truitt to the Council. And hope to see most of you at that time. Mr. Bradford Jacobs, the Vice Chairman of the Board of Trustees.
I know of only one word which describes the timing which brings Richard Haas tonight before the Baltimore Council of Foreign Policy. The word is exquisite. Why? Because even tonight, missiles are going in West Germany, going in England, going in Italy. These are peculiar missiles, terrifying missiles. They cling to the ground, they go under the Russian radar. This scares the hell out of the Russians. It also scares the hell out of a lot of Western Europeans and a lot of Americans. So make no mistake about it, we put our foot on a perilous path tonight. Now, I don't know whether to call that good news or bad, or even to call it news before a richly informed audience like this. But I do have one tiny little bit of undiluted good news, and that is that Mr. Haas is here and present. Let me just read you for full flavor his title. He's a Deputy for Policy in the Bureau of European Affairs, Department of State. Now that's a pretty starchy line of words. Let's look behind it for a minute. He graduated from Oberlin, won a Rhodes Scholarship, took his master's and his doctorate at Oxford, returned to the United States, served in the Senate as a foreign policy advisor, served in the Defense Department as a consultant, has served in several capacities further in the State Department, including currently one for which he is a special consultant to coordinate affairs in Cyprus. That job alone, I would think, would be like sticking your finger into a live light bulb socket. So here he is, and he is before us. And in case these series of credentials add up in your mind to some sort of a high-level gunslinger, let me add one last note. His field at Oxford was philosophy, which is sometimes defined as reflections on the human condition. Dr. Haas gives me the greatest warmest satisfaction to welcome you to Baltimore.
Thank you very much. That is what is known in the trade as a very difficult act to follow. And also, before any of you think I am so impressive by my credentials, I should point out that the Secretary of State appointed me to the position as Special Cyprus Coordinator about 2 months before we had a crisis on Cyprus. So much for credentials. After talking with Dr. Bird several times, we thought that what might be best tonight, given the fact that it's towards the end of 1983, was to take a look not only where we are, but a bit of a look back and a bit of a look ahead. And in particular, to focus on two questions. That of the Atlantic Alliance and that of the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union, or more generally, between West and East. And as a result, I've entitled my remarks tonight, The Alliance and East-West Relations After Deployment. Deployment obviously referring to the missiles that you've just heard about. What I would like to do is speak for about half an hour or 35 minutes. I'm never exactly sure how long it takes. And then I am open to your questions, and I look forward to those very much.
Pardon me, but could you move the mic so we can hear you better?
Sure. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. I'm not so sure I want all of you to hear me. 1983. 1983, more than most years, has been an important one for the United States, for our close allies in Western Europe, and for the Soviet Union. As has been mentioned already, deployments of Pershing II missiles in West Germany, as well as ground-launched cruise missiles in Italy and the United Kingdom, have begun. Just recently, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the NATO foreign ministers, as well as defense ministers, met in Brussels. The prospects, as we sit here tonight, for our principal arms control negotiations with the Soviet Union remain unclear, as is more generally the future of our relationship with the Soviet Union. Tonight thus provides what I think all of us would agree is a good opportunity to assess the state of our relations with our most important allies and with our most important adversary alike. What I'd like to do, though, before looking ahead, is look back and start about a decade ago. The 1970s. The 1970s was a decade which was the occasion of several strategic developments with what I think must be described as disturbing implications for the security of Europe and the United States and the alliance more generally. Let me just list what I think were the most important. Firstly, the Soviet Union had achieved finally, after years and years of effort, strategic parity or rough equality with the United States. What this did was raise doubts in the minds of many Europeans about how much they could count upon us, about our reliability, and about, in particular, the reliability of the American strategic umbrella or strategic guarantee to their well-being. Secondly, the Soviet Union also had begun developing a powerful new threat in the form of highly modern, multiple warhead, intermediate-range nuclear missiles, which were directed at their neighbors, both west and east. These were missiles which could not reach the United States, but could reach all of Western Europe and could reach most of Asia. They did this despite the fact that the strategic arms limitation process, the so-called SALT process, had left them already with significant advantages in this class of weapons, in missiles of this intermediate range. And thirdly, the Soviet Union not only achieved long-range strategic parity and not only increased its superiority at the intermediate range, but they also sustained their massive investment in conventional non-nuclear forces, which gave them a considerable degree of superiority in that area as well. Not surprisingly, the combined effects of these three strategic developments was to raise European concerns about European security. What was required, I would say, was a response to this Soviet challenge, a challenge which constituted nothing less than an attempt by Moscow to establish nuclear supremacy in Europe, to intimidate European publics and governments, and ultimately to separate, or to use the term of art, to decouple the United States from Western Europe. I think that recent events can only be understood, that is, the events of the 1980s, against this larger canvas. Restoring a balance of nuclear forces for this administration in Europe was necessary to maintain military deterrence. Restoring a balance of nuclear forces in Europe was also necessary to reassure our European allies of the durability of our commitment to their defense. And restoring a balance of nuclear forces in Europe was necessary for one last reason, that is to signal Moscow that its ambitions were to be checked. I would just hasten to add one thing. It wasn't simply this administration, but it was the predecessor to this administration as well, which came to the same conclusions. The members of the Atlantic Alliance responded to this multifaceted challenge from the Soviet Union by undertaking what I think all would agree was an unprecedented set of consultations. Their efforts came to fruition 4 years ago this month, that is December 1979. At that time, the Alliance reached what is known as, and I'll probably refer to it several times tonight, the dual-track decision, or the December 1979 decision. What that decision did was two things. On one hand, it called for the Alliance to modernize its own nuclear forces, that is, its intermediate-range nuclear forces, through the deployment of 572 Pershing II missiles. What this is a modern ballistic missile, as well as a number of ground-launched cruise missiles, the total being 572, a mixture of the two types of missiles. At the same time, the Alliance reached a second decision. That is, it mandated that an equal effort be made to explore the prospects for negotiating limitations or reductions of this class of missiles with the Soviet Union. So what one had was two tracks, a modernization track and a negotiation track. In addition, it was decided that the results of any negotiation, that is the second track, could modify the scale of the planned deployments, that is the first track. Moreover, the timetable the Alliance adopted allowed 4 years of negotiations between the United States and the Soviet Union before even the first of the deployments would begin. It then went on to allow 5 additional years, from the time of the first missiles, when they would go into Europe, until the total number would be deployed. In effect, the Alliance wanted the United States and the Soviet Union to have plenty of time to explore fully the arms control dimension of the 1979 decision. As I said, I'm raising what I'll talk about now, I'm raising because there is the myth that somehow this is a decision that has been foisted upon the Europeans by the Americans. Let me just give you some sense of what kinds of consultations have gone on. It has been, as I mentioned before, I think unique. The Alliance established a group known as the Special Consultative Group, which to be the principal forum for discussing the arms control dimensions of this 1979 decision. In this year alone, this group has met 14 times. As if this were not enough, it was not, however, the only group or the only forum in which these decisions were discussed. Allied heads of state and government have used the whole range of bilateral and multilateral meetings which the Alliance has to discuss these decisions. And just last week, it was a major topic at the meeting in Brussels of foreign ministers and defense ministers. In addition, our negotiators have made it a point to brief our allies before, during, and after every round of the principal arms control talks. If this alliance does nothing else, it meets and it talks. I think that it was this display of unity, this intense effort, which in large part brought the Soviet Union to the negotiating table in the first place. It's interesting to go back again a few years. The Soviets initially refused to talk after the 1979 decision by the Alliance, unless NATO first renounced it. When NATO held firm, only then did the Soviets agree to sit down and talk. Finally, formal negotiations began in 1981. However, once at the negotiating table, the Soviet Union was not responsive to proposals. Instead, they decided to do most of their negotiating outside of the conference room. And what they did was they launched a rather intensive propaganda exercise against the Western Europeans, using a mix of appeals and threats. All in all, I think the Soviet propaganda campaign, was a negative one. It sought to divide and weaken the West along 4 separate axes. And let me just lay these out to you. The Soviets tried to divide Western publics from their governments by stimulating fears and by playing to popular emotions on the nuclear issue. Secondly, the Soviets tried to divide Americans from Europeans by portraying the INF program, the Intermediate Nuclear Force Program, as a unilateral American initiative, rather than as an alliance response to concerns initially expressed by European leaders. Let me just step back for a minute. In 1977, I lived in London, and I worked at a place called the International Institute for Strategic Studies, which I think is considered to be one of the major think tanks in this arcane field I work in. And the then Chancellor of West Germany, Helmut Schmidt, came to London and delivered a speech. And it was Helmut Schmidt who first drew major international attention to the inequality that had grown up of these forces, who drew attention to the implications of that, and who basically said it was now time for the alliance to address this. This was not something which was made in America and packaged in America. To the contrary, the original impetus did come from Europe. Thirdly, the Soviets, besides trying to divide Western publics from their governments and Americans from Europeans, have also tried to divide our European allies from our Asian allies by focusing the negotiations on Europe while continuing to build large forces targeted against Asians. And fourthly and lastly, the Soviets have tried to divide the nuclear from the non-nuclear powers in Europe by attempting to include the independent British and French national deterrence in what was and is a bilateral U.S.-Soviet negotiation. The result of this Soviet effort to divide has been an alliance which finds itself in a strategic contest to sustain what I would describe as credible deterrence in Europe. It has also forced the alliance to engage in a political contest to preserve its own cohesion. I think a principal reason that NATO has succeeded in meeting these challenges has been its commitment to negotiation and arms control. The record shows that the United States and its allies have been searching for ways to reach an arms control agreement which would make the deployments unnecessary. If I may, I'd just like to quote one sentence of President Reagan, or rather two, when he said earlier this year, "I am determined to explore every possibility for equitable arrangements to reduce the arsenals and the risks of war and to strengthen the foundation for peace. And I have so instructed our negotiators." And as one who has seen the instructions go out in cables to negotiators time and time again, I think few statements have been as true as that one. In an effort to make progress over the past 2 years, we have gone about offering a number of proposals. In every case, these offers came after and followed close consultations with the allies. The President, in late 1981, announced that the United States and NATO were willing to cancel the planned deployment of the 572 Pershing IIs and ground-launched cruise missiles if the Soviets would agree to destroy all their missiles of a comparable class. That is, and pardon the jargon, their SS-4s and SS-5s, which were an earlier generation, as well as their most modern SS-20 missiles. This is what became known as the so-called 0-0 option. 0 for us, 0 for them. It was then tabled as a formal proposal in Geneva at the negotiations. The Soviets, however, resisted real negotiations. Their position throughout has admitted only one outcome. Rather than a 0-0 outcome, it is what I would call, what others have described as a half-zero outcome. Under this formula, the Soviet Union would be able to retain a substantial force of SS-20s in Europe and Asia. The U.S. would be denied the right to deploy even so much as a single missile. As a result, these talks did not advance. Once again, the United States tried to encourage movement by making a new proposal. President Reagan last March announced that the United States and the Allies were prepared to accept an interim agreement. This approach would establish equal global levels of U.S. and Soviet warheads of this range at the lowest possible number, and we gave the Soviets a choice, some number between 0 and 572. Again, however, the Soviets refused, and again they argued that only they could possess such missiles. The United States could not. As the date for deployments grew closer, we again made new overtures. In September of this year, that is just several months ago, we introduced 3 new proposals indicating flexibility on what had been several major sticking points: on the geographical allocation of deployments, on the so-called mix of Pershing II as opposed to cruise missiles, and on, we said we would also consider limits on aircraft. That is, we would expand the negotiations to take into account more than missile warheads, but would also possibly take into account aircraft in Europe. No headway was made. In November, in yet another effort, we called on the two sides to agree to an equal global ceiling of 420 warheads of this type. The number was intended to match a number the Soviets themselves had suggested in the course of the negotiations. We believe that the evolution in our position over the years offered the potential for progress. But the Soviets on 23rd of November, several weeks ago, announced they were unilaterally discontinuing the negotiations. They cited what they described as the appearance of U.S. missiles in Europe and the votes in the parliaments of West Germany, Italy, and the United Kingdom endorsing the 1979 dual-track decision as their reason for suspending the talks. Let me just add one more point to this mix before going on. One, I think, also has to remember that these proposals were made not in isolation. Something else was going on at the same time. What they were was consistent with other efforts the alliance was making to reduce the level of nuclear forces in Europe. The Allies agreed in October of this year to withdraw 1,400 nuclear warheads from Europe. This is on top of the 1,000 warheads that NATO had agreed to withdraw from Europe in 1980. This means, with some quick arithmetic, that NATO will reduce the total number of warheads in Europe by 2,400 since the alliance announced the dual-track decision 4 years ago. The resulting nuclear stockpile in Europe will be the lowest for some 20 years. Moreover, any deployments of these new missiles, that is, from 1 to 572, will be matched 1-for-1 by withdrawals of existing warheads from Europe. As a result, even if NATO is forced to deploy all 572 of these missiles, we will still end up with far fewer warheads in Europe than we had in 1979. If one totals it up, in essence, we are withdrawing some 5 nuclear warheads for every one that will be deployed. Let me just contrast that with what I think has been a clear pattern of Soviet behavior, and unfortunate behavior that goes in the opposite direction. Soviet deployments of the SS-20 have increased steadily since 1977, when the first such missiles of this type became operational. Let me just throw out some numbers at you, and I apologize. It's times like this I wish I had a blackboard. In 1977, approximately 7 years ago, the Soviets had approximately 600 warheads of this intermediate range. They now have more than twice that, some 1,300, more than 1,100 of which, that is the vast majority, are modern warheads on the modern SS-20 missile. What is particularly troubling, as if these numbers weren't enough, is that even after the negotiations began in 1981, and even after the then President Brezhnev announced in March of 1982 that the Soviets would place a moratorium on further deployments in Europe, their deployments went ahead. The Soviets, as we talk here tonight, are currently building new SS-20 bases in the eastern part of their country. It's worth noting that the Soviets completed one of these new bases in November and another one this month, just after they left Geneva. So much for the notion that several people have put forth that the Soviet Union is simply reacting to the West. I'm reminded of a comment by my former boss, Harold Brown, who was the Secretary of Defense in the Carter administration. He said, "When we build, the Soviets build. And when we don't build, the Soviet Union still builds." Unfortunately, I think the facts have borne that out all too completely. Okay, enough about the past. A few things about the present and future. In the aftermath of this initial deployment of these missiles, an awful lot of people, I think, are quite understandably asking the questions, what now? Is the challenge that the Soviet Union has posed to NATO over? are our prospects for arms control? Are they good? Is there any chance for arms control? The quick answer would be that the answer to the first question, that is the challenge to NATO over? The answer is no. The answer to the second question, is there any chance for arms control? I would argue yes. Let me answer them a little bit more in detail. The challenge to NATO's unity will continue. There is no doubt about that. The Soviet decision to walk out of the Geneva talks themselves is simply one form of pressure. Their deployment of additional intermediate-range systems capable of threatening Western Europe and Asia is another form of pressure. So too is their threat to deploy new sea-based systems, submarine-based missiles, off the coasts of this country, off the coasts of the United States. I'd argue as well that their unjustified attempt to brand these long-planned deployments, these are not things the Soviets decided upon overnight. These were planned for years. But their attempt to brand them as a reaction to NATO's decision, and NATO's decision, is another form of pressure. So obviously, I think the sum of that is the Soviet Union, from its own perspective, is not giving up. The fact that these missiles have gone in, the Soviets are not saying, fine, it's over. They are setting in for what I think is a long haul, a long campaign to continue their strategic challenge to divide the West. The prospects for arms control. The first thing to note is that we in the West cannot ourselves determine the future for negotiation. I think by definition, arms control is not a unilateral endeavor. Clearly, the alliance will continue to work together in an effort to reach agreement. And we have stressed specifically our willingness to halt, modify, or reverse deployments if an agreement makes this possible. As Vice President Bush stated when he went to Germany, what goes in can come out. Nonetheless, and I'll make this clear, the alliance is under no obligation to make concessions simply to get the Soviet Union back to the table. Indeed, I would argue the alliance ought not to. It's for Moscow to decide if it wants arms control as well. If no agreement is reached, the alliance will proceed with the planned deployment schedule for the next 5 years. In the aftermath of deployment, though, I think the alliance must turn its attention to some other issues as well. One of these is improving conventional forces, a step that, among other things, will require that we take advantage of some new technologies that will become available to us. NATO's conventional forces, its conventional deterrent, has been, and I would argue will continue to be, integral to its strategy of flexible response, and more importantly, to deterrence in Europe. We've taken steps, as I've described tonight, to modernize our theater nuclear forces. We've also taken steps to modernize our long-range strategic nuclear forces. We cannot afford to ignore our conventional forces. We recognize that many of our allies, as well as ourselves, have economic problems that have led them to cut defense spending. However, if the INF issue shows that we do possess resolve and determination when necessary, it seems to me we must apply that same resolve and determination in this area. I would argue, though, that we cannot simply work to spend more. We must get more work from what we spend. One way that we may be able to improve conventional weapons and at the same time lower the cost of producing them is by more cooperation across the Atlantic. There's a wonderful phrase for this, the two-way street. It means that we should be able to sell certain things to Europe and they should be able to sell certain things to us. In each case, taking advantage of things they do better and we do better. As a result, and for the economists in the audience, there would be all sorts of economies of scale so that the alliance as a whole would benefit. Another item which I think the alliance has to turn to is cooperation on matters beyond Europe. As you know, the NATO alliance is largely defined geographically in terms of continental Europe and the waters around it. However, in a world of interdependence, in a world with the Soviet Union which has a global reach, and in a world in which we have vital interests scattered among many regions, we do not have the luxury of concerning ourselves with simply the European or any other continent. Let me make clear that we are not looking to expand the geographical scope of NATO, but we are looking to expand the geographical horizons and the geographical involvement of its members. We need, for example, to do more to protect the flow of oil from the Persian Gulf. and we need to do more to continue to promote peaceful change in Lebanon and other troubled parts of the world. I think one of the lessons we've learned over the last 10 years or more is that the Atlantic Alliance can only prosper in a stable world that encompasses but is not limited to Europe. Let me just add one last thing I think the alliance has to look to, and that is its future. As you may have guessed, I was born after World War II. After 35 years of the alliance, however, we're facing a time when not simply the person who's standing in front of you tonight, but virtually the entire leadership generation of the alliance will also have been born after World War II, or will certainly have come of age at a time when the lessons of the war and the lessons of the immediate post-war period will not be immediate ones. They will be lessons that they've learned or read or heard about but not lived. I think one of the possible results is that these new leaders are likely to have less immediate understanding about why the alliance is the way it is, about why Americans and why Western Europeans banded together. Indeed, I would argue that we are already beginning to see the effect of this lack of understanding on both sides of the ocean. It seems to me that one of our principal tasks will be to ensure that the alliance, its programs, its activities, so forth, are understood by people on both sides of the ocean, and particularly younger people. The alliance, if it is to endure, must be responsive and imaginative enough to stand this test. I think the last 35 years provide an awful lot of reasons about why it is in our interest for the alliance to endure and stand this test. That said, I think in the course of my career, that would probably be the single biggest challenge that many of my contemporaries will face. But let me return to something more immediate, which is the East-West relationship, or the relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States. I think that an important element of this process of trying to retain consensus in the alliance, particularly among younger people, will be if we can be seen to be effectively managing our relations with the East. I think that such a consensus exists today, although we sometimes lose sight of it probably amidst the intense debate that is the natural hallmark of an alliance which is democratic, sovereign states, and at times as well as composed of what perhaps undiplomatically described as outspoken countries. The Declaration of Brussels, which just came out last week, rose out of the foreign ministers' meeting, sets forth that consensus which does exist today. The foreign ministers, quote, noting that our legitimate security interests can only be guaranteed through the firm linkage between Europe and North America, then went on to state the following: that we are determined to ensure security on the basis of a balance of forces at the lowest possible level, and secondly, that we stand ready in cooperation with the East to bring about a long-term, constructive, and realistic relationship based on equilibrium, moderation, and reciprocity. We recognize in the Reagan administration, we recognize the necessity of engaging in a dialogue with the Soviet Union if we are to accomplish these objectives that were just spelled out. We urge the Soviet leaders to reconsider their decision to leave the Geneva INF talks. Similarly, we stand ready to achieve progress in the START, the Strategic Arms Reduction talks, negotiations, and believe that the Soviets should agree to an early date for their resumption. In addition, we are talking to Soviet representatives at the conventional or NBFR talks in Vienna, and Secretary Schultz plans to join his fellow foreign ministers at the opening of the Conference on Disarmament in Europe, which starts in Stockholm in mid-January. Let me hasten to add that the arms control arena is not the only one where the Soviet Union and the United States can and must engage in dialogue. From the early days of this administration, the two countries have pursued an intensive dialogue in three other areas as well. That is the area of regional stability, human rights, and bilateral affairs. And let me just say something briefly about all three before concluding. The administration, that is this one, believes that despite our profound differences, and I wouldn't want to underestimate them for a minute. Both the United States and the Soviet Union have a stake in working toward regional stability. Both of us have an interest in working to ensure that regional tensions do not escalate in dangerous and unpredictable ways. We've sought full and frank exchanges with the Soviets on what would be necessary to reach a political solution, for example, in Afghanistan. We have talked to the Soviets about events and how best to ease tensions in regard to Southern Africa, in regard to the Middle East, in regard to Central America. We seek to regulate our competition wherever it can be done. The Soviets have not, to be frank, been as responsive as we had hoped, but we will continue to try to make these exchanges productive. In the human rights area, U.S.-Soviet differences are also clear. We have been disturbed by increasing Soviet abuses in this area, particularly in light of the fact that the Soviet Union is failing to meet international commitments it agreed to in the Helsinki Final Act. We urge the Soviet Union to be more forthcoming in this area as well. It is for this reason we were pleased when they decided to grant exit visas to the Pentecostalist families that had taken refuge in our Moscow embassy for almost 4 years. Lastly, we have also sought to place our dealings with the Soviets in economic, cultural, and other bilateral matters on a more firm basis and a more lasting basis of reciprocity and mutual interest. The conclusion of a new long-term agreement on grain this past summer shows that our economic relations can be beneficial to both of us. But there needs to be greater Soviet restraint if trade and other bilateral relations are to develop more fully. Yet for all this, dialogue alone cannot succeed in bringing about a stable relationship with the East. Indeed, I would argue we could only prosper in an environment in which the possibilities for Soviet adventurism and Soviet intimidation are reduced. The Soviet Union is more likely to exercise restraint when it is convinced of the strength and will of the United States and our allies. It is for this reason that one cannot separate the prospects of arms control from our determination to carry out needed military modernization. It is for this reason, too, that one cannot succeed in bringing about Soviet restraint in the absence of Western economic recovery. And it is for this reason that a stable relationship with the Soviet Union cannot come about in the absence of a united alliance and a bipartisan foreign policy consensus here at home. Above all, I think history shows that a relationship with the USSR requires a large dose of realism on our part. We should not expect dramatic breakthroughs overnight. We have all too many reminders that Soviet policy accentuates the role of force. We see this in Afghanistan. We saw this in the Korean airline atrocity. We see this in the way the Soviet system represses its own people. Despite this, perhaps because of this, we are open to an improved relationship with the Soviet Union. And clearly we must search for areas of cooperation while we accept there will be areas of competition. We are and are likely to remain adversaries. That said, we aim to convince the Soviet leaders that they have a shared interest in exercising restraint, a shared interest in limiting our competition. In the nuclear age, there is no alternative. We hope, as a result, that the Soviet leaders will abandon their goal of supremacy and the politics of intimidation, and instead come in good faith to the negotiating table. Let me end with just one or two final thoughts. The ultimate purpose of the Atlantic Alliance, of which we are a key part, is not to deploy new military systems. Rather, I would argue, and I think others would as well, that the ultimate purpose of the Atlantic Alliance is to deter and, if necessary, defend against its threats to itself and its interests. We are, however, committed to deterrence, if need be, by deployments, if given a choice, by negotiation. Our basic message to the Soviet Union is thus that it is in our common interest to reduce both the level of arms and the chance for confrontation anywhere. But we are more likely to get the answer from the Soviets we would prefer if we in the West are seen as united and determined. For nearly 35 years now, the Atlantic Alliance has provided the necessary unity and determination. Indeed, it is no coincidence that this country and its principal allies have enjoyed unprecedented peace and unprecedented prosperity during this era. The challenge before us is then to sustain this cooperation. Only in the cohesion of the West lies the potential for a constructive relationship with the East. Thank you very much. You just want me to stand up here and take some questions? How do we do this?
Our format, as you all know, varies. And Mr. Haas has indicated after his most comprehensive
view the past, present, and the future. And as you know, the future quickly descends into the present and lapses into the past. There is some talk of the concept of Star Wars. Where do we stand? That is, do you think we are developing capability of winning such a war, deterring it successfully, or what?
Let me answer that with a few points. The first is that no one that I know has any illusions about winning a nuclear war. There will be no winners. There will only be losers. That is the first point. On the so-called Star Wars scenario, this is a term which describes, I think a bit unfairly, but all the same describes an initiative the President made earlier this year in which he announced in a speech that the United States would begin to explore, or actually continue and accelerate the exploration of a new generation of technologies that was either becoming available or potentially coming available, which, if they worked out, could provide the United States with a defense against ballistic missile attack. We don't know, to be perfectly honest, if these technologies will yield fruition. We do, however, think that they deserve to be explored. What we are doing, as a result, is intensifying and accelerating our research programs into these new technologies. We are doing so in a way that is fully consistent with the 1972 Treaty on Ballistic Missile Defense, and we are doing so in a way that does not prejudge the outcome of this research. We will do the research, and then after several years, in discussions with our allies, and discussions with the Congress, and discussions more generally with the public, this administration, future administrations, will have some very important decisions to make. It just was concluded by the President that the prospects were too important not to be explored fully, and that's where we are. Sure.
That's a comprehensive description of what I would call the chess game theory of armament control. They build, we build, we deploy, they deploy. But if you're a philosopher, you said almost nothing about the ultimate ethical question involved in this. And I wonder, as a philosopher, as a human being, under what circumstances do you personally justify for using these weapons? And if you can't, do you really have any credibility?
Let me correct the record slightly. I was flattered by my introduction. I've got a doctor of philosophy. I am not a philosopher. More seriously, the ethical questions of nuclear deterrence are obviously among the most difficult, if not the most difficult, ethical questions of our time. It seems to me, though, there's a relatively easy way to answer them, which is that the ethics of nuclear weapons are to be found in nuclear deterrence. The ethics of nuclear weapons are not to be found in their use, but it is in the threat of their use, which hopefully precludes their use. when one looks back over the last 35 years or 40 years, whatever else one thinks about nuclear weapons, one has to look at what I think is an unprecedented era of peace between the major powers of the time. One is hard put to find another historical era in the last 300 or 400 years of the contemporary nation-state system when one can find a parallel era in which the major powers of the time managed to limit or confine their competition. I think it is because of one development, the development of nuclear weapons. I think that nuclear weapons have provided us with deterrence, and I can think of no higher ethical outcome. Winston Churchill, I think, was the first person who pointed out the incredible contradiction of nuclear weapons. It took the most awful thing that mankind could produce to bring about the most precious thing that mankind can ever have, which is peace. That is where I come out on the ethics of nuclear weapons.
The scenario seems to be that the Soviet Union will be nuclear. But suppose both sides, and he must achieve a stalemate of terrorism, but suppose both sides conclude that it is idiocy to throw the torch into the gasoline-filled room, and the Soviets use their massive superiority in conventional forces. Are we prepared to deal with that and to pay the political price of dealing with it?
That was one of the reasons I mentioned in my talk about the need to do something about conventional forces. NATO, since its founding, has not done enough on conventional forces. It's depressing but true that the first set of force goals the alliance laid out, the so-called Lisbon Force Plan, which is now more than 30 years old, since then we have, for 30 years now, failed to meet our own conventional force commitments. Conventional forces are expensive, they're manpower intensive, and so forth. It is unfortunate but true, we've fallen short. It seems to me that in the future, it's a luxury that I don't think we can afford very well, that we've got to do more. In some cases, it'll mean spending more. In some cases, it'll simply mean using what we spend more efficiently. But I do not want the Soviet Union to think that it can realize its objectives in Europe or anywhere else through the first use of conventional arms or nuclear arms of any type. What one wants to do is deter the Soviet Union for use of all arms. And one of the best ways of doing it is by having a strong conventional defense. Unfortunately, the economics, and as a result, the politics of the economics often get in the way. But I, for one, can think of few higher or more important goals for the alliance. Yeah.
Even though the nuclear weapons have produced nuclear deterrence between the major powers, isn't there a terrible danger in the nuclear proliferation amongst the smaller countries? There are countries like Libya might just decide to throw a bomb. What are we doing about that? What can be done?
It's a good question. I think there's a fairly broad consensus in this country, one that stretches across political parties as well as Congress, executive branch, and so forth, that so-called nuclear proliferation, or the development of nuclear weapons by countries that don't yet have them. At the moment, only 5 or 6 clearly have them, depending upon how you count. But as many as 10 or 15 could have them perhaps fairly quickly, and who knows by the year 2000 or 2020 on how many could have them. And obviously, the spread of nuclear weapons horizontally rather than vertically, which is what I've been talking about most of tonight, is a real problem. Just because the Soviet Union and the United States have been able to maintain a deterrent relationship doesn't mean that we will be able to recreate miniature deterrent relationships in every theater or region of the world. It doesn't mean that some terrorist group is going to have the same rational calculation of cost and benefit and will come to the conclusion that it's not worth using nuclear weapons because of what might happen to them. We've seen enough suicide bombings in the last few months to bring home the lesson that all sorts of people in the world have a frighteningly different set of calculations and values than we do. So obviously, what we've tried to do is slow, stop, spread the whole, both of the weapons, that's a clear objective. We've tried to square the circle of promoting the peaceful uses of nuclear energy with our efforts to stop the military uses of nuclear energy. And just as important, outside of these two technical areas, we've tried to reduce the political incentives for various countries to resort to nuclear weapons or to the development of them. And this is something that can involve everything from conventional arms transfers to American guarantees and so forth. It's important because there are political tools to be used here as well as technical tools. And what you realize is that a lot of your foreign policy has to at times be orchestrated or directed in order to achieve that objective. But there'll be no single day when we can announce victory. This will become a permanent feature of American foreign policy. It will be a process that'll have to be conducted every day in the context of a whole host of bilateral relationships. There's no answer. We just have to, there's no definite answer that we can do X and solve the problem. It'll just take an awful lot of foreign policy instruments used, I think, very creatively and with great sensitivity to work. But that's clearly one of the handful of major items that will face this or any other administration.
Why can't our current force, which has more than enough power to destroy the Soviet Union, be sufficient without worrying about the escalation by the Soviet Union?
The question of deterrence. The question was why, tell me if I'm poorly phrasing it, but why isn't our present force, which has enough destructive capacity in it to more than destroy the Soviet Union once or several times, why isn't that enough? I think there are several reasons for that. One is deterrence is in the eyes of the beholder. It is not simply enough that we ourselves feel confident, which is important, but also that the other side feels deterred. I want the Soviet Union to be deterred in two ways. One, I want it to be deterred in a very rational way. So when my Soviet counterpart, some young man on a policy planning staff or whatever, or in the Bureau of American Affairs in the Soviet Union sits down and thinks about nuclear war, he comes to the very rational conclusion that it does not make sense for the Soviet Union to strike first. That what is important is not simply how many weapons we have, but it's the ability, it's our survivable weapons, and that we have enough there. So even if the Soviet Union did strike first, we would be able to respond. I want the Soviet Union to know that, in which case it is my belief they will not be tempted to strike first. Second of all, in a crisis, I never want the Soviet Union or anyone else to be tempted. Crisis stability is one of the most important things we can look for. And it's terribly, terribly important that we have a margin of safety so that in a crisis, no Soviet politician or general will say, maybe the nuclear option's looking tempting. I never want them to say that. I want there to be no shadow of doubt that the nuclear option is not a viable one for them. And lastly, I think that nuclear weapons have a political importance beyond their military importance. Whether one likes it or not, they matter. And people look to them for reassurance. And just as like the Europeans in the late 1970s looked to this one class of nuclear weapons as reassurance, so other allies and so the American people look to nuclear weapons at times for reassurance. They are the most awful weapons ever created, but again, it's almost what I said in the answer to that question about the ethics of nuclear war. They are a form of reassurance. They have kept the peace, and they have protected us so we can go about our lives and sustain the values that we hold dear. It may be a high price to pay. I would just argue that the alternative is worse, and I, for one, would not want to reduce nuclear weapons unilaterally, for example, and perhaps begin to reduce that margin of safety or make the Soviet calculation a bit closer or add a little bit of doubt to how firm our deterrent force is. But reasonable men can disagree on how much is enough, and I respect them.
You mentioned before the deterrence when rational consider a first strike. It seems to me that the dangers of some of the issues of first strike are heightened in the case of nuclear terror. You have a compact continent loaded with nuclear weapons, I assume that any action of either side will be preceded by conventional attack. And then you're in a position where, given the small power, you're in a use or lose situation. Either they overrun our weapons or we overrun theirs, in which case the temptation is very great height to launch a nuclear exchange. Why indeed couldn't the same level of deterrence be assured with weapons further back, for example, a submarine bringing it? Why indeed are we trading so much on it?
One of the things we are doing is constantly looking at how to not only modernize, but how to improve the safety and ultimately the deterrent value of the nuclear weapons we've got in Europe. It's for that reason that we've carried out a lot of these reductions in the last few years, that a lot of those weapons weren't necessary, a lot of them weren't safe, and so forth. There's an alliance group, the high-level group, which is responsible for the defense ministers of the 16 alliance countries, which specifically has as its mandate this question of the shorter-range nuclear forces. And one of the things currently going on is looking at the entire posture, where these things are located, how many of them we have, what type we have, and so forth. And one of the things that will come out of them is hopefully a more rational allocation, distribution, and so forth. The question of sea basing is one here, as you point out, is an idea that different people have put forward. I would just note on that, quite interestingly, that when I was in Europe living there in the mid-70s, and we were looking at what kind of, this is before the 1979 decision, what kind of intermediate nuclear forces the alliance wanted. And some people suggested sea basing, some people suggested land basing. It was interesting that many Europeans themselves wanted land-based systems, because psychologically these were seen as a much greater commitment. These were seen as much more reassuring. It's ironic now that land-based missiles have become, in many cases, a lightning rod for political protest. But at the time, land-based missiles were reassuring, and I would argue continue to be reassuring, that psychologically they form an important element. And lastly, for deterrent purposes, one never wants to put all of one's eggs in the same basket. One wants to have a mix of systems. And that way I think one increases their chance of survivability, it increases the difficulties the other side has in trying to destroy them or defending against them and so forth. The people who know something about mathematics tell me it's something to do with cybernetics and the rest, but there are certain types of interrelationships and lots of different ways of basing these systems, and since the whole becomes greater than the sum of its parts, and I think that's useful.
You represent the Department of State, background, of course, is in defense and security. We talked a lot about numbers and disarmament, but I would like to know what efforts are being made on the causes of the conflict, because that is what state is. The causes of the conflict. I recognize it's not that simple to resolve them, but for long-term peace, you must address the causes of the conflict and not just play numbers.
I couldn't agree more. It seems to me that all these weapons are not an end in themselves. When they're there, they serve a purpose. One would obviously like to live in a world where they were redundant or unnecessary. That said, I'll be perfectly frank with you, as we say in the diplomatic trade. Be careful, by the way, whenever you hear diplomats saying full, frank, and candid, it means you're in for trouble. I think that the history of international relations is a history of competition. It is the nature of societies, it is the nature of states. There have been views for hundreds of years, if not longer, of different approaches that would either do away with or limit competition, whether it was the Holy Roman Empire, whether it's through the rule of law, whether it is through disarmament, whether it's through the League of Nations, the United Nations, or whatever. The idea of, there's a wonderful book called Power and the Pursuit of Peace. The pursuit of peace is as old as, I would say, the international community itself. We have no new ideas fundamentally about that. What I think in government, what one does is try to pursue peace in modest ways and what seem to be realistic ways. The kinds of things I talked about tonight, the dialogue we try to establish with the Soviet Union, is one of the ways we try to pursue peace and try to get at the cause of war, to reassure the Soviet Union that our interests are limited and that our interests and their interests are not mutually exclusive. In many cases, we have common interests, and there's room for both of us. One of the ways that we try to get away from the causes of war, I would argue these numbers do matter. And deterrence is one of the ways that I think very effectively we have dealt with the causes of war. We deal with the causes of war in various regional diplomatic efforts, whether what we're trying to do in Southern Africa, negotiating Namibia, what we were trying to do in Lebanon, what we were trying to do in Central America. It seems to me that the whole host of diplomatic instruments, whether it's negotiation, whether military forces are present or arms transfers, whether appeals to people's common sense, whether it's promotion of economic development, political modernization, what have you, whether using the United Nations, whether using regional organizations. All of these things are efforts to get at the cause of war. There's no single one that will work. But obviously what you've got to do is put together a foreign policy that draws on all of them. I think we do a fairly decent job without necessarily accomplishing any great breakthroughs. But I think that it's probably unrealistic to look for breakthroughs of that order, of that magnitude. I mean, I, for one, would feel very content with successful management. Competition is never going to go away in the international system. What one can reasonably expect is the management of tensions, of competition, so conflict doesn't break out, or if conflict breaks out, that one stops it at a low enough level and soon enough so that it doesn't escalate and spill over. That, to me, is the hallmark of a successful foreign policy.
When was the authority to fire off all of those missiles in Italy and England and France and Germany?
Well, the alliance has all sorts of arrangements for the so-called control of its missiles. These are American missiles. The United States has the ultimate authority. There are all sorts of consultative arrangements and so forth. And obviously the interests and the wishes of the host country, where the missiles are given special weight. But there's a whole elaborate set of alliance arrangements and then American arrangements and so forth. The bottom line is that I think we have a very good mix, on one hand, of safety and precaution, on the other hand, of potential responsiveness, so we don't weaken the very deterrent these missiles are there to provide.
You paint a very eloquent picture of that defense posture.
Thank you.
But apparently, the administration can't sort of waffles on it. You seem to see a conflict between the Department of Defense and the Department of State as to how to deal with the Russians. Why can't we present a unified posture to the Russians as to how we want to do it?
Well, I argue that to my defense colleagues and say all they've got to do is agree with me. I think that sometimes the difference is, one, are not so bad, and two, are a bit overdrawn. If I were the president, I would get nervous if everyone started agreeing. I think that the fact that he does get different points of view is probably healthy. And this administration, like any other administration, is a coalition and is a broad church. And if any
Even in the trade issues, they don't know whether to trade with them, or not to trade with them. They can't get legislation through Congress. Really, the Russians look at us as not being credible.
Well, let me say two things on that. On issues like that, trade or whatever, there are some pretty good arguments on both sides of lots of these issues. And I would expect, for example, the Agriculture Department and the Secretary of Agriculture to be sensitive to some of his constituencies. The Commerce Department to his, the Defense Department to theirs, the State Department to theirs, and so forth. The nature of bureaucracy is that you have all these things there, and then you come out with a policy. The fact that the decision-making process looks messy, again, doesn't bother me that much. I've always thought that in messiness was a bit of protection. It probably meant that the president was getting lots of different kinds of advice, and he would not do something and then be surprised so much by the reactions or the implications. If I were president, I would never want to be surprised. I would always want to know the different possible reactions to what I was doing. And in this administration, more often than not, he gets those beforehand. That's why I forgot the second half of the year.
No, that's really, I interesting that we don't convey it to our own.
Oh, and the idea of the Russians. I think I think it's probably difficult for the Soviets and others to understand our system. Half the time they get it wrong because I don't understand it either. But it's very funny at times to hear foreigners talking about the American system. They say, the State Department's doing that, the Defense Department's doing that, the President's saying that, this guy in Congress is doing that. Obviously, this is all planned and this is a conspiracy. And I said, you've got to be kidding. We couldn't do this if we wanted to. I think that they have learned to live with a degree of almost dissonance of voices, at times, if not competing policies, at least coexisting policies. If one, come to respect that. Two, be that as it may, I think when you're standing in downtown Moscow, the similarities emanating from the United States outweigh the differences. The general thrust of American policy is clear, and whatever differences there might be, I think would pale in comparison to where the consensus is. Whether or not you're talking about raising your defense budget 6% or 8% or 9%, in the Soviet Union it's bad no matter what. And I think that's pretty much the way they see it.
Now, one thing I recall reading in the papers this fall about the various proposals on the Treaty of Geneva was that it seems like we were willing to consider all of the Soviet missiles as part of the negotiations and all of our missiles, but not the English and French missiles. And I was wondering why we weren't willing to consider them, the whole universe of missiles.
That's a good question. The reason was that from the beginning, this was a bilateral negotiation between two countries, the United States and the Soviet Union. The British and French deterrents are independent, sovereign, national deterrents. They're not subject to our decision-making. We made it very clear to the Soviets, and I think they understood this, that what we needed was an equal levels between the United States and the Soviet Union. That said, let me add two things to that. I think the Soviet attempt to raise this issue as a key impediment for progress is fairly scurrilous. If one counts the missiles of the British and the French, and then counts like-minded systems on the Soviet side, which are also, let me point out, not included in these negotiations, you have many, many thousands of Soviet systems not included in these negotiations, to just over 100, approximately 150 on the British and French side. So the numbers do not back up the Soviet position. And lastly, the Europeans themselves have said that if the day comes when the US and Soviet totals get low enough, where the British and French systems seriously pose a threat to the prospects for arms control, in a sense when the Soviet argument finally becomes legitimate, they will be glad to consider what role they can usefully play in arms control. It seems to me that it is up to the Soviet Union to hasten that day. Ma'am.
What safeguards are there against false nuclear alarms?
All sorts, technical and human. That movie I saw a few weeks ago, or months ago, with those young boys punching into is fortunately not quite accurate. If it were, I'd begin to worry. I'd lose my hair faster than I am. There's a whole series of safeguards built in technically in terms of redundancy. There's simply one computer saying one thing is not enough. Obviously, one has lots of computers which have to do certain things. Then there's a whole human element in it. I'll be honest, I do not stay up at night worrying about that, about the possibility of accidental war. I think it's something that one has to take into account. I do not, though, think that in the scale of probabilities, it is at all high. Which is not to say we don't constantly have to improve our system, and we are. And one looks at some of the improvements made over the last few years, and they're important. But it really is not high on the scale of probabilities. I don't know if that reassures you.
On the Russian side, too?
We don't know as much about their system, to be perfectly honest. But I would expect, given the layering of decision-making in the Soviet Union, particularly about, one would think, decision-making of this magnitude, that there would be a lot of caution on their side as well. And technically, in this area, they are very advanced. The Soviet Union is a society where you do not have a broad degree of high-tech modernization. But what you do have is certain segments or sectors of the society where the Soviet Union has put a great deal of its scarce resources. Those areas, the Soviet Union is fairly competitive. And one of the areas that they have fairly advanced systems is, for example, in their strategic nuclear area. At times I look at the capabilities of their forces and I feel they're all too advanced and capable. I was told I have one more question. So, sir.
You mentioned that the Russians have deployed their missiles and that we're in the process of deploying our missiles. My question is the threat of nuclear war less today than it was 3 years ago?
I think in both cases the threat is terribly, terribly, terribly distant and small, which is in a sense the most important answer I can give you. I, for one, feel that there was no significant threat then. I don't feel there is a significant threat or an appreciable threat then or now. That said, I think the steps we have taken over the last few years and the steps that we have undertaken to take in the coming years have enhanced deterrence. So to the extent that one can weigh your question, I think that the shift, what the Soviets wonderfully call the correlation of forces, is something that is going in the direction of enhanced stability. And I, for one, think that is a welcome development.
Fully, frankly, and yes, candidly, Dr. Haas, and we now know what that means. I don't know whether I'm more reassured or more frightened by your talk, perhaps both, which I suppose is a way of saying that maybe we've all seen a few dark spots illuminated that we didn't know were there,